everybody, and welcome to this our ninth afternoon or evening, morning seminar on inclusive education. My name is Richard Reader, I'm the General Secretary, and in a moment I'll hand you over to Sarah Kamau, who's our chair, to say an introductory few slides. A couple of things to say before we get going. One is, last week you should have got a evaluation form to complete on units 1 to 7. We would very much appreciate everybody doing that. And if you know other people who were on the course but have dropped off, also get them to do it. The reason is we need to account to our funders for what we're doing here, and we want to go on to a third phase of offline but resources provided in different languages and for computers rather than online. And so obviously we want evaluations that show this is a worthwhile activity. So I just ask people to do that. Next week is girls and women and disability, and I think that will be a good event as well. And the material for that is going up tonight on the website with a course book and follow-up activities and a presentation. So that's keeping you all on your toes. But today we're going on to inclusive education. Is that showing up all right, that PowerPoint?
Yes.
Right,
yes.
Brilliant. Okay. So I'll hand you over to Sarah to say some introductory things about inclusion, and then I'll take you through a range of activities, films, and presentation. Sarah.
Thank you, Richard. How everybody, and I want to thank you especially for being part of this course this far, and we hope to see you up to the last module. For introducing the module on inclusive education, I will start by giving a few quotes on what inclusive education is about. And the first one is from Alliance for Inclusive Education. And it says, inclusive education, also called inclusion, is education that includes everyone with non-disabled and disabled people, including those with special educational needs, learning together in mainstream schools, colleges, and universities. The second quote from UNICEF says nearly 50% of children with disabilities are not in school, compared to only 13% of their peers without disabilities. Robbed of their right to learn, children with disabilities are often denied the chance to take part in their communities, the workforce, and the decisions that most affect them. Another quote from UNICEF also says about inclusive education is the most effective way to give all children a fair chance to go to school, learn, and develop the skills they need to thrive. Inclusive education means all children in the classrooms in the same schools. It means real learning opportunities for groups who have traditionally been excluded, not only children with disabilities, but speakers of minority languages too. Inclusive systems value the unique contributions students of all backgrounds bring to the classroom and allow diverse groups to grow side by side to the benefit of all. I'll give a more introduction now on the rights to inclusive education. And the right to inclusive education encompasses a transformation in culture, policy, and practice in all formal and informal education environments to accommodate the differing requirements and identities of individual students, together with a commitment to remove the barrier that impede that possibility. It involves strengthening the capacity of the education system to reach out to all learners. Inclusive education also focuses on the full and inclusive participation, accessibility, attendance, and achievement of all students, especially those who, for different reasons, are excluded or at risk of being marginalized. Inclusion involves access to and progress in high quality formal and informal education without discrimination. It seeks to enable communities, systems, and structures to combat discrimination, including harmful stereotypes. Recognize diversity, promote participation, and overcome barriers to learning and participation for all, focusing on well-being and success of students with disabilities. It requires an in-depth transformation of education system in legislation, policy, and the mechanisms for financing, administration, design, delivery, and monitoring of education. This is according to the general comments number 4 of the UNCRPD Committee 2016.
Thank you. Thank you, Sarah. So we're going to unpack that. That it's not us making that up. That is the official body that oversees the implementation of the UNCRPD, who after a number of years of getting poor reports from state parties, which are outlined in the course book, they decided they needed to clarify what inclusion was and what it wasn't. And that is a very useful guide. So in order to understand it, we need to go back to the paradigm shift we talked about in ways of thinking about disability in module 1. And we're moving here from a medical model, which sees the problem in the child, to the social human rights model, which sees the problem in the structures, systems, and operating methods of the education system. So in the old medical model, the child impairment is seen as the focus. Let's try and make them as normal as possible. So we have a lot of people employed everywhere in the world, social workers, doctors, special transport, educational psychologists, separate special schools, training centers, sheltered workshops, benefit agencies, occupational therapists, speech therapists, GPs, local doctors, hospital doctors, specialists, and the child development team. That's a lot of people, a lot of resource. And a lot of what they do is useful rehabilitative work for people, but quite a bit of it is not particularly useful and is not the best way that the child could actually develop. Some children, for instance, with cerebral palsy are not going to walk and would be better off as wheelchair users. And yet a huge amount of time is spent by occupational therapists and physios and trying to get them to walk. Others, it's about handwriting when in fact using some sort of mechanical device such as a speech processor or a laptop or a computer would be much better for them in terms of time, because they're going to use that all their life to communicate. So what we need to move to, and which we came about, this transition didn't just come from the UN, it also came from disabled people and particularly parents. And wherever I've gone in the world, whether it be South Africa, India, Argentina, wherever there's been a movement for inclusive education, the UK, actually at the bottom of it is a parent who's saying, why shouldn't my child be included in school the same as everybody else? And then disabled people have come in alongside them and supported that campaign. And that's how we got to inclusive education being what we want. And in order for that to happen, the thinking of disabled people has to come into this. And this is where sometimes it's gone wrong, not least in the language that we've talked about, the people first language, when people not understanding that disability is an oppression and it is the barriers that we're up against regardless of what type of impairment we have. It's the barriers that provide segregated services, lead us to poverty, as we saw in Module 5, beliefs in the medical model, lack of accessible information, inaccessible transport, prejudice, devaluation, inaccessible environments and lack of useful education. And I talked about a barriers activity in the presentation, if you haven't watched it yet, getting people to identify the barriers for people with different impairments in their schools, and then ask the question, how many of these barriers are to do with a within child factor? And they are not. They are to do with a constructed environment, an attitudinal environment, and an organizational environment that was largely designed with disabled people not in mind. For so-called normal people, of course, nobody is normal and they all have different needs, but that's the way that it came. So having said that, if we put that way of thinking into the way we structure education, if you don't go to school at all, you're excluded, or you can be chucked out of school if you've got bad behavior or problems that haven't been understood, and that could also be exclusion. Mostly in the rich world, we sent disabled children until very recently to separate schools. First, a long time we didn't send them to school at all, and then we sent them to separate schools which worked at the pace of those children and gave them the support that they needed. The problem was they had to be away from the community very often. They were bullied, abused, and they didn't get much education out of it. And most certainly they were not interacting with their peers, which here I've got a diagram of the square pegs and the round pegs in two different toy boxes, and they didn't mix at all. Then some people went on and said, well, this isn't fair. They should at least have lunch with us and maybe do a bit of art and drama and go out at break, but the lessons should be separate. So then the square pegs were taught in a separate classroom, but they mixed with the round pegs. And that's the model that operates in most schools in the United States, actually, at the moment. There isn't full inclusion there. There's integration of this sort. Then came along and said, well, maybe we should try and reshape the square pegs to fit into the round holes. So things were done, therapies, all sorts of support to make the child function as if they didn't have their impairment. Very much medical model approach, and didn't work by and large. And sometimes there were different rooms where children with different shapes diagnosed were there some of the time, and sometimes with their mainstream. But those are all forms of integration. They are not inclusion. Inclusion is where everybody is taught together in the same classroom with support, the right support that they need, and the peers are supporting, the teacher supports, there's teachers' aides who support, and there are adjustments are made so that the child can thrive at their own pace. So that's very clear. So just to be clear, this is what the UN committee said of these 4 states. Exclusion occurs when students are directly or indirectly prevented or denied access to education. So the denied access. Segregation occurs when the education of students with disabilities is provided in separate environments, designed or used to respond to a particular or various impairments, in isolation from other students. So those are clear. The third is integration, is a process of placing persons with disabilities in existing mainstream education, as long as the former can adjust to the standardized requirements. So there is no real adjustment being made for them in integration. Whereas inclusion, the committee says, involves a process of a systematic reform embodying changes, modifications in content, teaching, approaches, structures, strategies to overcome barriers with a vision of serving to provide all students of the relevant age range with an equitable and participatory learning experience. So that's all very clear. Now let's see how well you have understood that, because here's our first activity. I'm going to read out 5 statements, and all you have to do is decide for statement 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 whether what's being described is exclusion, segregation, integration, or inclusion. Okay, so statement 1, and I'll leave these up so you can look at them while you're thinking and writing your comment in the chat. Statement 1 is Louisa uses a wheelchair. She wants to attend her local school with friends from home. She can, with their help, get to school. The school has no wheelchair access, and so she has not been able to get through the door and is handed work to do outside. She's probably not got a toilet to go to either if there isn't ramp access to the classroom. So that's number 1. Number 2 Zahir is in standard grade 8, uses a hearing aid, can lip read a bit. The students in his class all sit in alphabetic order. This means he has to sit at the back because his name begins with Z, and therefore struggles to hear and keep up with the rest of the class. His teacher, when he asks, refuses to make an exception for him, as she says she must treat all students equally. So that's number 2. Number 3, Solomon has a learning difficulty. Solomon needs to have someone explain clearly what is going on in the class. He has a classroom assistant assigned to him, and she and his teacher work out together how he can be helped to access the learning that other children are being offered. The teacher takes care that the assistant works with other children, and the other children are encouraged and supported to work with Solomon. So that's number 3. Number 4 is Patricia has epilepsy. She is just learning to monitor her impairment for herself. She needs to take her medications every lunchtime. Her class teacher has a note on her register to make sure that she is reminded to do so. So far, there have been no problems with this arrangement. Sometimes she fits, and the rest of the class think she is bewitched and do not play with her. So that's number 4, Patricia. And the last one, number 5, Office has got a visual impairment and some learning difficulty. His parents are ashamed of him and living away from the school. He helps with the family business of basket making and has never been to school. So there you go. 5 scenarios: 1 Louisa, 2 Zahir, 3 Solomon, 4 Patricia, and 5 Office. I want you in the chat now to say which of those at the top there, exclusion, segregation, integration, or inclusion, applies to these scenarios. I'll give you a minute or so to do that. Thank you. Okay, Gemma, I think we'll make a start. Can we go on number 1?
Yes.
Louisa, first of all, what do people make of that one?
Got some different answers to this. Just please excuse me while I scroll, and I apologize now if my dogs suddenly start barking. Okay, so we've got integration. 1, 2 people have said that. Somebody else said exclusion. I've got more than one person saying exclusion. I'm just letting somebody in. Somebody else said segregation. Somebody else said exclusion. Another one for segregation. Another one for exclusion. Segregation, segregation. Another one for exclusion. 2 more for exclusion. Another one said integration. 2 more said segregation. Another one said exclusion.
Okay.
Yeah, that's it. That's where we are.
Okay, well, she is going to the school. She is being handed work. The school and the teacher just haven't made any adjustments for her to get into the classroom. A simple adjustment could have been that the teacher brings the whole class outside and they have the lesson together sitting in a circle. So it wouldn't have cost anything. A more costly one might have been to get the facilities to improve the school from the local municipality and recruit parents who have building skills to widen the door, build a ramp, and make the toilet accessible for her, and maybe get a desk that she could sit behind. Those would all be processes of moving towards a more inclusive environment, but it is a form of integration. It is not segregation because she's not in a separate place in the sense of being in a separate school. There are elements of exclusion there within the school. She's being sort of, if you like, internally excluded, but I wouldn't say segregation applied. Let's go to number 2, shall we?
Okay, so number 2, I've got integration, segregation, exclusion, segregation, integration, segregation, exclusion, integration, exclusion, integration, exclusion, integration. That's it.
Okay, well, it should be integration. I think this is a classic example of integration. The teacher has the wrong idea of equality, right, for a start, and we've said this before. Equality is not treating everyone equal, because treating everyone equal, if you start from completely different disadvantaged position, will never lead to equality. It will always lead to inequality. So it is actually providing people with what they need to thrive. What this child needs to do to thrive is to sit at the front. It's a very small, no cost adjustment, and one of the most basic adjustments that one would expect. So that it's really, the problem is coming from the teacher, who is not understanding what inclusion actually means, which is meeting the needs and adjusting to meet the needs of each child in the classroom. It's certainly not exclusion because they are in the classroom in the sense that we have defined it as defined by the UN CRPD committee. And it's not segregation because he's in the classroom. So it is poor integration. Okay, let's go to number 3. What do people make of that? Solomon.
3 was unanimously inclusion.
Oh, I'm glad you're on the right track. Yes, it is. That's the best example of inclusion that we have here of these 5. And the things to note are that the teacher is working with the support worker, the classroom assistant, but is making sure that the child isn't just with that classroom assistant. Often can lead to internal isolation in the class. They're encouraging other peers to work with the child, and they are planning together. So it isn't just the teaching assistant who's trying to make sense of what the teacher says. They're actually planning together how to adjust the learning for that child. So that's good inclusive practice. What about number 4, Patricia with epilepsy?
Number 4, I've got a mixture of segregation, exclusion. Somebody said integration. Yeah. Lots of exclusion, segregation again.
The person who said integration is right. It's again integration.
That's
Why
Beth.
Not inclusion? Because they are getting the medication right. They're allowing her to become self-monitoring of her condition. Why it isn't inclusion is that they haven't prepared the children in the class and challenged the traditional ideas, the discriminatory ideas, that is the role of the teacher, has to challenge these ideas. You cannot have a classroom where prejudice rules. It must be, and whatever the class is doing, as a teacher for years, I always did this, you always stop what you're doing and you have to deal with the racism, the sexism, disableism, the homophobia that is going on in the class, and say, we don't do that here, that is not acceptable, and these are the reasons why, because this leads to the various things that happen to people. If I put, instead of epilepsy there, albinism, Many of you in Africa and some other parts would know immediately why it needs to be challenged, because if not challenged, those children are killed. That's serious, and we need to tell children about this and not pussyfoot around it and lie. We need to be honest with children about where prejudice and discrimination lead, because that hasn't happened in this class. It's poor integration. And the last one.
So the last one is almost unanimously saying exclusion, but I've got a couple that said segregation.
Well, he's not in a school, he's with his parents, and therefore it isn't segregation, it is exclusion. The parents are ashamed of him and think he won't be able to manage at school. Clearly, people need to reach out to him from the school or from community-based rehabilitation, convince the parents that he can do well in school, prepare the school for him to go there, and support him in getting to the school. Clearly, he could benefit from education because he is able to do the basket making and therefore has hand-eye coordination and other things that he can actually use to learn at school. Okay, so I think that's been quite useful, but it's always very important to go back to specifics because these words are bandied about without them having actual meaning. And remember that this is a process that's going on in schools, even in the best schools, and we'll have a look at a couple of film clips in a bit. You will find good things and bad things. The process is underway. Nobody will always get it right, but then people, teachers, principals, parents, pupils should know they can get things wrong in this journey to develop inclusion. So we're going to look at this film now of Ebotwe Primary School. And what I'd like you to note down is what are the things that make this school, us think that this school has an inclusive ethos as we listen to this film.
Ebotwe Primary serves the township of Mdantsane in the Old Transkei. It is an area of high unemployment and poverty. The school works with many different individuals and organizations through its school-based support team to meet the needs of disabled and disadvantaged learners.
And sprawling shack of houses or squatter camps right around the area, where about a half of a school ratio is the learners who are from those squatter camps. Some are child-headed families, some are orphans.
The school nutrition program ensures that children here get food and drinks each day. The school works with voluntary organizations such as Rehab, and some children at Ebotwe receive support from the Nelson Mandela Children's Fund. Ebotwe is a full-service school supporting many learners with learning difficulties, and staff are dedicated to working inclusively.
By bringing those children with problems, it helps them not to feel discriminated. They feel as the part of the community, not as it was done before when they were kept at home. The parents felt shy about them. Now, with this inclusive education, they feel as the part of the community.
Miss Mkhole is a member of the school-based support team. The team also includes the principal, other teachers and members of the community. The team advises staff on support strategies for any child who's experiencing difficulties.
We've got a police in our institutional learner support team. We've got a nurse there. Also, we've got an occupational therapist, a member of disabled people in South Africa. One lady here is also in support group, the one for HIV and AIDS. We also have a remedial teacher included. We look at people with expertise who are going to assist us. We've got a vibrant team here.
The team supports staff to plan support for any child experiencing difficulties. The team works closely with parents and seeks the advice of other specialists when necessary. At the time of filming, Ebotwe Primary was using temporary accommodation. The Department of Education is renovating Ebotwe's own school buildings to ensure they are accessible as part of its program for the conversion of ordinary schools into full-service schools. When in their own classrooms, staff regularly display children's work to encourage all children to feel proud of their achievements and to show the children's work to the whole community.
Got an accommodation problem, but we used to place our learners' completed task on the chalkboard so that even the parents can see the child's work. Whoever is coming to visit the child's class can see the work.
At Ebotwe, the school-based support team work to promote inclusion within the whole community.
We also have community workshops so that they know inclusive education and how it works. Because we found out that we do this inclusive education in the lower level, but at the higher primary, high school, it is not practiced. So we do help also the educators of the higher primaries where our kids move from our school to through those schools. So we interact with them all the time. We share the information.
At Ebotwe, each child has a learner profile. It includes as much information as possible on each child's skills, learning needs, and any medical needs. The learner profile is passed from grade to grade, and information is added by each grade teacher.
When the children are leaving our school at grade 4 to grade 5, we move that back. We move that learner profile to the school where the child will be attending grade 5 to. That is, we move the whole information moves to the next school so that those teachers knows exactly how to handle that particular child. Inclusive education is not about being perfect, it's about understanding the strength, the can-dos of a particular person.
Okay, so what I want you to do in the chat now is, what are some of the things in the film that tell you the school has an inclusive ethos? Some of the things that you saw in that film clip that tell you that the school has an inclusive ethos. So let's just put a few of those for each of you into the chat, and Gemma will read out a range of them. So again, another minute to do that, please.
So that's just, sorry,
Yeah.
that's just for question A.
Question A. Let's just do A and see how we get on with that. Okay, shall we try and get some of the things people have put in?
Sure. So this is just in answer to A.
Yeah.
The answers are still coming in.
Yeah.
The school looks at the strengths of the students, what students can do as opposed to focusing too much on what they cannot do.
Yeah.
They're encouraged and supported.
Yeah.
Seems they actively seek out disabled students to promote inclusion.
Mm-hmm.
The performance of the learners is examined regularly.
Mm-hmm.
Supporting teachers in the same classroom.
Mm-hmm.
The disabled children are involved in all activities. A few people have said this, they provide the information on the child to the next school as the child progresses.
Mm-hmm.
The teachers liaise with the entire class, all are included for the support. Continuity is encouraged. Teachers have a positive attitude towards children with disabilities. Support team to provide advice and assistance in making the school inclusive. They try to understand the strengths of the individual. They show the work of all students to make them feel proud. They're renovating school buildings to make them accessible and interacting with higher schools so they move up and be included.
Good.
Yeah, somebody else talks about the learner profiles being shared. Let me just see if there's anything different.
I would add to that, if no one said it, the principal, who's the leader of the school, has clearly got a very strong inclusive ethos and a very clear understanding of not just the disabled children, but all of the deprivation and poverty in their catchment area. And I think a general point that I would make about any inclusive primary school is that that principal needs to have a very clear understanding of all the children who are in their age range, who live around the school, and ask the question, why are they not coming to school? Because they should all be coming to the school. The local school should be serving the needs of all the children that live in the catchment area of the school. And the principal should be the person who's leading on that with the support that they need in order to do it. Let's just say now a short time, what more could be done to make the school more inclusive? B. So if you put into... Hello? Someone wanted to say something? If not, mute, please. What more could be done to make the school more inclusive? B. So what else could happen to make the Botway more inclusive? And we need to bear in mind that they're not in their permanent place at the moment. They're in temporary accommodation when we see them. So just jot down, if each of you can think of one thing that would make the school more inclusive, would be good, I think. Okay, so one thing that would make the school more inclusive than it was there. Let's read a few of those out, shall we?
Okay, introduce sports activities for all, as in for all, because I saw kids jumping and there were those who could not jump. But if there was something like sitting sports, many could join. The building needs to be sort of renovated in a way that's going to make it accessible. Somebody else has said that, need accessibility improvements. Make sure the playground is even and accessible to all learners. Possibly more funding to provide additional support.
Well, more funding, I think one of the first things you might want to do is to reduce the class size. Now, there were 3 teachers in that room with about 70 children, so the ratio wasn't too bad. But it limits what you can do to have such a large number. So, you know, to develop peer support work is very difficult in a room that size. You need to turn the desks round so that the children are facing each other rather than facing the front, and that they work with each other, and the adults in the room come round and support them. So a reduction in class size would be useful, I think, but also changing the shape of the room. Yeah.
We've also got education of all partners involving parents, teachers, community.
Yeah.
Sign language should be taught in the class. More space is needed and more staff.
Yeah.
The education district needs to be made aware of the problem that the primary school is inclusive, but not the next level.
Yeah.
The next level of grades must be supported to do the same.
Yeah.
Somebody says, I was concerned with the form of assessment. I hope they'll be assessed differently based on their individual abilities. They need to have the data of learners with disabilities, accessibility, structure if not accessible, and use of universal disability design, spacious classroom, more staff.
Well, hopefully when they're redesigning the building, I'd probably like to go back and visit some of these schools. It's quite a while since I made this film about these schools. It was in 2008-9. One, I hope they've flourished and are still there and have improved. But two, you know, we hope that that full service school model in South Africa has spread to many more schools. I have heard that some pressures have gone in the opposite direction, and there have been more special schools in the provinces. They've used the money for that rather than building the schools. So there is a conflict going on there. Okay, I'm going to move on. Thanks for that. But it gets you to think. And if you want to do the same activity, the film on the school in Mpumalanga, which we also filmed on, is in the presentation. So you could have a look at that and ask yourself the same questions if you wanted to try it on another South African school. So I'm going to talk about now some levers for change, which are important for inclusion. So the first one I want to try is parents and DPOs. And I mentioned before that I think it's parents who've been at the core of any move towards inclusive schools. This, the film that was a bit of in the presentation about Zanzibar was an organization of parents and young learners with learning difficulties. And it's interesting that that's usually the group that's most excluded, yet the parents had formed a very strong alliance on the two islands of Zanzibar and had gone out from that to train the teachers and get their children into school, and particularly into training post ordinary school so that they could have jobs. So that was very much led by the parents. And then in Zanzibar and in Tanzania itself, Matuja Inclusive Education Consortium, again, very much led by parents and DPOs who've supported that. And I think that's very important to see that. Second thing is capacity building, and this can never be enough of this capacity building. That's a picture of me doing some training, I think in the Pacific, and there's next to it is a capacity building we did on inclusive education in South Africa. The third picture shows an outreach worker, probably from community-based rehabilitation, going around visiting homes in the catchment of the school and saying, why aren't these children in school? And in the presentation, you saw people doing that in the slums of Mumbai. The UNESCO had produced some really useful resources on teaching inclusively for all teachers and all children, but then one booklet, this particular one, Teaching Children with Disabilities in Inclusive Settings, is a really useful one and can be reached on the UNESCO website. There are lots of other aids and materials, not least on the World of Inclusion website, that I would commend to you if you're actually going to engage with this process. Most of you will be in DPOs, and the DPOs can play a really important role in awareness raising and training of staff, parents, and the local community to create a climate inclusive of inclusion. I mentioned Dharavi, and we had a film about that, and it's interesting that from those small classrooms that were made for 3 to 6 year olds, spreading from the first there, they ended up with, I think, 26 throughout the Dharavi slum of over 1 million people. And then they worked with the schools around using the SSA across, which is now across the whole country, and will be mentioned in the next clip. And that led to those children who in the noughties were in these Angwaris or nurseries, going right the way through with their peers in the state school system with the support. Now, of course, there was an NGO supporting them, ADAPT, or the Centre for Inclusion in Mumbai, and it was their individual project. But from these little projects, government policy has developed. And now Shruti is going to tell us a bit about where we've got to in India with all of this.
Thank you, Richard. We have come a long way in India, but still there's a long way to go. The good things in India is we have a very lot of good laws right now in place, lot of good policy framework, such as the Right to Education Act, which was amended in 2012. It looks at getting children with disabilities into private schools and the entire cost being reimbursed by the government. Similarly, the Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan, which is quite well known and now called the Samagra Shiksha Abhiyan, it looks at free education for children with disabilities in all government institutions from the age of 6 till they complete their 12 years of schooling. The new education policy, which has come very recently in 2020, it has expanded the scope of inclusive education to a great extent by taking care of some of the gaps that existed. Now we have certain curriculums for teachers, which is called a B.Ed or a M.Ed, where they study to become teachers. Unfortunately, these courses, modules, did not look at understanding of disabilities, categories of disabilities, and what were the needs of children with disabilities in the early stages. So the National Education Policy is talking at length about including disability orientation, categories of disabilities, early identification, early intervention, and the different alternate methods of teaching and evaluation in all education colleges, which is going to equip the teachers. You see, most of us as organizations working in this sector, we feel that teachers are not really interested or enthusiastic because their capacities are not built to handle children with disabilities. But they are open to it, and many 700 teachers that we had interviewed and met, they said that if given an opportunity, given a refresher course, and if they can learn and understand about it, they would be more than happy to accommodate children with disabilities in their classrooms. So that's one thing which the new education policy is addressing. The second big lacuna was children were coming to school at the age of 6. We were talking about inclusive education. But the formative years, from 0 to 6, we were not looking at anything. How the child will learn, how the child will go to the primary and kindergarten, what are the supports that are to be provided to them, how their capacities can be built to cope up in a mainstream school. And this new education policy is also emphasizing on that, how in the kindergarten, in nursery classes, children, those who have disabilities will be accommodated, their needs understood, and what kind of educational support through playful means will be provided to them. Another major constituent I personally feel for education is often children, they need different kinds of therapies. They need speech therapy and physiotherapy, which is so necessary for their school education. But this was never part of our education system. Though briefly, the Samagra Shiksha Abhiyan talked about assistive devices and about therapy, but it was actually never practiced in a big way. But largely because of the activism of non-governmental organizations, of DPOs, this is now being considered in a big way. And I'm sure in the forthcoming years, we will have more number of children getting therapies books in alternate format, basically creating a structure where they are at ease, where they are comfortable. So these are certain things which are going to happen with the new education policy in place. And I'm quite hopeful that more and more children will come back to school.
So that's awareness raising, the involvement of DPOs, and a snapshot view of what's happening in India, the largest of the Commonwealth countries. And by the way, we send our sad greetings to our colleagues in India and the terrible death toll that's currently going on there. And it does show that governments can't take their eye off the ball, whether it be COVID or inclusive education, if things are to be actually moved forward. A third thing to do, which is really important and was touched on in those other two levers, is mobilizing the local community. And we mentioned this when we were looking at some of the scenarios, that we can mobilize, and these are examples from East Africa of the local community being mobilized to, one, change the built fabric of the school, paint the classrooms white so the children with low vision can actually see better, build accessible toilets, ramps, and handrails, as here. Often this works well with the Parents Association, having people with building skills coming for a weekend, building at the school, and the local district can provide the resources and the parents the labour power, and that is a quick way of getting things done. If you want a more organised way, then it's about really guaranteeing that the jobs are done by people who are paid to do them. But either way, we need to involve them, and we need to involve parents, particularly in the running of the school through the management committee or the governing body, and to make them aware of why inclusion is so important, and for them to be critical friends of the school, asking the right questions so that things move forward. It's important to influence government, and there are a number of ways we can influence government. This should be coming from below. The first is to make sure there is one ministry for all children's education, not that disabled children are under the Ministry of Social Protection. That means that they're not actually getting proper education, so we need to campaign for that. We need to change the grade system, which can keep kids, and I've said this before, stuck in the same grade for years and years because they just don't get something. Children should move forward with their peers through the grade system, and we should have a differential assessment and a differential curriculum for them. And that is a challenge to teachers, but teachers need to rise to the challenge. We need to incentivize families to enroll disabled children in the school. Most importantly, we need to recruit many more disabled teachers. Some of you on the call should maybe consider becoming teachers if you're not already. Example there of a blind teacher in India who has done a lot of work, and a wheelchair using teacher in England. And I know about this case because I interviewed at the school, and he, because of equal opportunity employment, they didn't come look at his form and say, oh, he's a wheelchair user, we can't have him. They interviewed him and said, yes, he's a good scientist and we can make him head of science. They then found out when he arrived that only one laboratory was accessible. It was on a multi-level school. And so they went to the government and got grant, and they paid some of it, and a lift was put in. So he could then supervise all of the other science teachers in this secondary school by going and visiting them. But it also meant that when we visited, about 6 children from the local area were now coming to the school who wouldn't have been able to, who were wheelchair users. So there was a benefit, a double benefit. And of course, all the other children saw disabled person in a powerful position with knowledge, and it challenged their stereotype thinking. So promoting inclusive education in the local community with community-based rehabilitation. So all of these things are really important. A big shout out for lever 5, peer support. We saw in the film the school in Mapika, where peer support methods were being used, child to child they called it. There's also a clip there from New Zealand where they rely on that as a method, and in Canada and to some extent in the UK it's been used very much, the child to child approach. The biggest resource, I said this already and I'll say it again, in any classroom is all the other children. We need to mobilize those children to support the education of each other. That means peer support, buddies, bully busting, and collaborative learning, where the teacher organizes children on tables with the children who are more effective, better at certain subjects, working with others as peer tutors and supporters. That's a way to maximize learning in the class. The research is all in one direction. A more able child in any respect, by having to teach another child, becomes much more proficient in the subject, and therefore they benefit. And the disabled child, or the child with needs, benefits as well, because they have a much better and easier relationship with their peer than they would with a teacher. So we need to do that, and we need to set up things like circles of friends and buddies. And indeed, in Canada, the first place to start organized inclusive education more than 65 years ago in Ontario, in the Catholic school boards, they did this person-centered planning as the first and most important thing. The intentional building of relationships was seen as the most important thing there. Targeted funding. Funding is a huge problem. Schools are underfunded. We need at least 11% a year rise from now to 2030. Money going into schools has reduced ever since the crash in 2008-10. There's a big meeting of the Global Partnership for Education to get more donors committed. But in the wake of COVID, we need much more money to rebuild education for all, but particularly disabled children who missed out don't drop out. We need to mobilize the international community and remind people that SDG 4 says good quality education for all by 2030. That's not very long. It's 9.5 years. So we need to really up our game here. And when we get on to talking about campaigns in local campaigns in module 13 and national campaigns in 14, this is one of the main areas that DPOs and disabled people need to be involved in, pushing government very, very strongly. We can also help with developing low-tech and high-tech solutions. We are experts in aids and appliances. That's what we use to access the world. We should actually give our knowledge to schools so that they can actually do that and do those things. So targeted funding is really important, and every area needs a inclusion support resource center, and that if there are special schools there, they can be converted to resource centers. But beware of that. They need to really not have children based there except for assessment. They need to be placed in their local schools, and the teachers and support staff from the center go out visiting the schools. As this teacher does here, an itinerant teacher for the blind, as these systems are set up throughout East Africa and Bangladesh and in India. And the scale, what these teachers can do by substituting a motorbike for a bicycle, they can reach 10 times more schools, and they would spend a couple of hours a fortnight with any one child who needed to learn Braille or mobility training. They would train the other staff and work with the individual child. And this has been shown to be a really effective way of not taking the child away from their local community, where they would often have to board in dormitories, but bringing the support to the child. Okay, we move on. Now, in terms of training teachers, I did a piece of work for UNICEF, which you can find on our website, but it was about how do we prepare teachers for inclusion of disabled children. And what we decided in the end of that was that there needed to be a twin track approach. Track one, which is education based on the principle of equality and child empowerment. And that includes equality and valuing difference, identifying barriers, finding solutions, differentiation and flexible curriculum and assessment. Some of the things that some of you mentioned, collaborative learning and peer support, anti-bias curriculum, challenging the oppressions that people are up against, and making sure it's challenged in the curriculum material, stimulating an interesting multi-sensory learning environment, child-centered pedagogy, creating a reflective group of teachers, and most importantly, quality education requiring rigor, effort for each child to achieve their potential. Not the same, but each child to achieve their potential. That's for all children. And that's what we would call good teaching, that they were equipped with all of those things. Secondly, they need to be a track with the second track, which is the impairment specific track, because it's no good just talking about all disabled children. There are particular reasonable adjustments and support systems that are needed for children with different impairments, such that blind and visually impaired children need tactile environments, maps, tapes, and so on, text to talk, they need braille, the mobility training, or they might need large print, magnification, orientation, they may need glasses, and an auditory environment and talking instruments. A deaf-blind child might need specialist language interpreters, tactile environment orientation. Deaf and hearing children need sign language, and they need adjustments such as being able to sit at the front, which we talked about. Physical impairment, we need accessible infrastructure, which we talked about, personal assistance, diet, transport, and medication, depending on their condition. Children with specific learning difficulties, of which there are many who get overlooked in our school, they need methods that can actually help them to deal with the difficulties they have in actually visualizing and connecting words to language and so on. So colored overlays, background, easy read, tape, text talks, reinforcements, spell checkers, concrete objects, all of these things have been shown to help. Speech and communication, there are many children who have difficulty articulating. Some children will never be able to speak because of their condition, so they need to have alternative forms of communication that are actually developed, and teachers need to know about some easy ways of doing that. They need to be supported by speech and language therapists with the specialisms. Cognitive learning difficulties, we need to develop the curriculum so it is presented in different ways, pictograms, small steps, curriculum, easy read, scaffolding, which is, for instance, producing a box of labels or cards that use the language of a particular thing that we're looking at, whether it be diet, agriculture, how the landscape was formed, physics, or so on. So with the words that we use there are there on cards to help the children. We need use of Makaton, which is a simple form of sign language for children who have some more significant learning difficulties. We need information grids, concrete objects. We need to use cameras. Children who can't write or read can still tell a story through using a camera, and they can put the pictures in the right order. That is learning, and that's what we need to be able to do in the classroom. We need to deal with mental health and behavior issues, ADHD, autism, and we will hear something from Emil about that in a minute. We need to screen, identify, and make the key adjustments for all the main impairments. If we equipped all our teachers with these two tracks of skills, which doesn't take a huge amount of time to do, to become a specialist in depth on any one of those can take a long time, but to have a general understanding of it that they can apply in the classroom, it would make a huge difference to what's going. And in all, therefore, we need to make sure we train for the twin track approach on all BEd and MEd courses that train teachers, but also the lecturers of those courses need to it. We also found out that just being taught it isn't enough. You need to have practical applying these things. So teaching practice before you become a teacher in a school, school-based, also training in the school, school-based support groups, school-based training, distance learning, and maybe accreditation from a distant university where you can actually study together as a whole staff. So for instance, if the school is there from 8 till 2, 1 or 2 afternoons a week, the staff stay behind for 2 hours. Why should they? Well, they'll get an accreditation for doing this. They can submit a master's study on studying one child or a group of children and how they've actually made it inclusive for them. Once they get the master's, they will get a raise in their pay. So it is certainly worth doing. It is better than withdrawing individual teachers, teaching them and then going back and getting them to teach all the other teachers. Doesn't work very well. And then also we spend an awful lot of money and time on allowing teachers to go off and do different degrees, which doesn't feed back into the school and is not really the best way to do this. So school-based district training is better, and we need to go on with that. Leaders also need training. We saw that a leader there clearly had training a way, and we need to make sure that the principal has the power and the budget to lead the team and to actually make sure that they are moving. And they need to be evaluated by their peers. So other leaders need to co-evaluate each leader about where they're going, and this all needs to feed into some sort of management or elected council that is evaluating how much progress is being made towards inclusion. We need a proper scheme for this to work. And of course, they need respect and salaries. I've been to many places where the teachers are not even there because they're not paid enough. They do the register and they go off and do another job and appoint a monitor. That isn't okay. It's not acceptable. And we have to break that. And the way we're going to break it is by creating respect for the teaching profession and paying them and treating them professionally and appropriately. There's a lot on universal design for learning based on new neuroscience that is very useful here. And you can go onto this website and look at some of the things that can be used there to break down barriers. I'm going to skip over that. My friend, Professor Gary Bunch, who was at a university in Canada, in Ontario, I did a lot of work with her for a period, always said that for a teacher, there are 4 key questions about any lesson that you're going to be setting up to have an inclusive lesson. As you're planning any lesson for pupils, ask yourself, what are the essential knowledge, skills, and understanding you want the student to get from the lesson? How do my pupils learn best? The teacher needs to know the different learning styles of the children, the different barriers that they face, the different reasonable adjustments that they need, and the different support that they need, and they need to incorporate that into their planning. They need to be given time by the principal to be able to do that. What modifications to the lesson plan would permit more pupils to learn more effectively in my classroom? All teachers are very used to modifying their lessons to enhance their pupils' learning. In fact, most teachers do about 700 or 800 adjustments a day. So it's not something that is alien to them to do that. How will my pupils show what they have learned? It's not about sitting tests. It's about asking the pupils to respond in different ways to what they've handled, asking questions, having a quiz, getting them to make something or to present something to the rest of the class to understand whether they've actually got the point of the learning. A bit like some of the follow-up work that we're asking you to do, we're not going to give you a grade for it. We're just wanting to see that you've actually understood the key ideas that we're putting forward in this course. It's formative assessment is what we call that. Now, Emil is going to talk to us a bit about autism. Emil is on our committee and he's from South Africa.
Thank you, Richard, and thank you, everyone. It's an honor for me to present to you today on the course of inclusive education. My presentation, I'm going to discuss examples of good practice to include students on the autism spectrum in an inclusive education system. The value of an inclusive education system encompasses a transformation in culture, policy, and practice in all formal and informal education environments. Students on the autism spectrum experience challenges on cognitive, emotional, social, as well as physical domains. In a mainstream education environment, students on the autism spectrum are exposed to the different forms of hierarchical masculinities and ableism. And as such, parent has got the choice to place these students either in a specialist school, considering remedial schooling, or even homeschooling. As an educator, it is essential that the education system must accommodate students on the autism spectrum on physical, attitudinal, information, as well as on communication domains. With reference to the White Paper 6 on the rights of persons with disabilities, considering a South African context, all education institutions are required to make the necessary reasonable accommodations. Education institutions must accommodate the student on the autism spectrum by making the necessary modifications, adjustments, assistive devices, and make use of technology. To provide you an example of good practice, Due to a lack of support students on the autism spectrum receive in a mainstream education environment, parents, like I said previously, consider specialist schools, and as such, which is registered as a non-profit organization. These schools are not mandated by the National Department of Education, and therefore they must make use of alternative methods to receive income. To accommodate these students, these schools are also making use of alternative curriculums that are skills-based and of primary focus to provide the students the necessary skills to be able to function independently in the workplace and in society. An example would be the ASDAM program from Great Britain. A practical example of such a school is Edu360 College, the school where I teach. The school is a specialist high school which operates across the neurodiverse spectrum. The school is independent, functional, and ensure that the students are job ready by the time they graduate. Another example of an NPO, a non-profit organization that provides training for educators, is the non-profit organization called Autism South Africa. And the course that I'm referring to is the hands-on autism course. Now, in this course, they discuss different methods to accommodate students in a classroom. And this course offers training and provides training on autism spectrum disorder, as well as teaching methods teacher can use. Thank you for the opportunity to present to you today.
So thank you, Emil. And I think that gives us a good idea. He talks about he's himself a teacher with autism, working in a specialist school for autism, which parents are choosing because really the mainstream isn't taking this seriously enough. But then Autism South Africa is running a course, a DPO, to actually train teachers to be able to accommodate children with autism in the mainstream. So that's a realistic view of where we are. So what is the evidence from around the world on inclusive education? Well, there is a choice of special segregated schools and mainstream. Disabled children do considerably better when matched for impairment type and degree in the mainstream schools academically. So that's the first thing from multiple studies has been found. Their inclusion has a neutral impact on the non-disabled children, but in a quarter of studies, it actually had a positive impact on the learning, and that's because of what I described as collaborative learning and peer support. Where it has a positive impact, their teachers have been trained in inclusive pedagogy and also have inclusive values. The more flexible the learning and assessment approach, the better the disabled learners do. So the more rigid the curriculum, the more rigid the grade system, the less well children do. So flexibility is definitely the order of the day. Those disabled young people who have attended mainstream schools and completed are much more likely to get a job, have friends and relationships than those who went to special schools or units and did not attend school. So it is a door to the social life of the school. And should that be denied to social life in society? Should that be denied to anyone? So this is from Alana. You can follow the reference up and see much more detail there about that study. There's also on the film we saw on the film from Singapore about their visit to British Columbia. If you go back and track to that website, there's a similar other studies reported there across different cultures. Now, the last activity we're going to do today is watch this film, which I made in 2015 in a primary school outside Bristol in South Gloucestershire. And it was a purpose-built inclusive school, and I want you to look at this, and I'm not apologizing for this. This is what can happen. I'm wanting you to look at this film and ask yourself, how can this practice that we're seeing here be translated into middle and low income situations so that we can develop inclusion? But we still need to look at something, how we can aim at this. So here we go. I'll clip it on.
The school was built with that in mind, so it's very much just part of the school, and the specialist provision is really the extra staffing and the specialist staff who support those children in class.
At the very beginning, we talked about what they wanted for their school, and one of the things that came out that was really, really important to everyone was around equal opportunities and everybody having the right to a decent education. It wasn't about including children and just being the resource-based children. It was about including every single child and thinking about what every child in this school needed so that they had the best opportunities to achieve and succeed in the wider aspects of school life, not just academically.
Most schools have a resource base, which is actually a base that would be somewhere on site. All of our children are fully included into the mainstream. The one thing that I found in SEN setting was that as much as it was lovely and the children were well looked after, they weren't necessarily pushed to their full potential. And that's one thing that I loved when I looked around this school. Every child is thought of individually. They're not classed as higher, middle or lower ability, and it's trying to push them on in their individual journeys. We have something called building, applying, extending. So our children work at the level that they think they're at, and teachers will, very, very discreetly go and push them on. So it's, very, very strategic how the teachers manage those lessons.
Because the school has, from the very beginning, been set up to think about how to include everybody, I think the children also adopt that and understand that.
Children are doing to suit Matthew. So he uses an app on the iPad to write his sentences, which are then printed out, so that there's some way of getting what's in Matthew's head out, so that he can be assessed like the other children, or he can express himself.
We normally try to plan a meeting in the early part of the week with the teacher, the inclusion teacher also, any relevant TAs in the class, because it's not just resource-based TAs, there'll be SEN TAs. We all come together, we read over the plans, and then we make suggestions as how we might modify the lessons that are coming up to suit the child that we're working with. It brings the subject to life for a start. It gives the teacher an insight into what we're hoping to achieve with the children and also what she wants from the children.
I think it's a really supportive place to work, and I think that inclusion doesn't just apply to the children. I think it's the whole staff as well, in that it's very supportive and people look out for each other, people problem solve together. As a governing body, we view inclusion as a very high priority. Whichever issue that we're discussing as a body, the inclusion element is very high on our priority list, and we look at that first. All the major school events, things like whole school trips, individual class trips, residential trips, they're just planned from the outset so that everyone can be involved and included. I would say that having that approach and giving that amount of thought and planning to what you do benefits every single child in the school.
my personal favourite element of the school. It works fantastically, and each of those children and his class collectively, they know that there is a difference, but there is no issue with that difference. Ralphie's doing exceptionally well at this school, and I think for his buddies as well, it helps them. They're gaining all sorts of responsibilities. So I think the buddy system, I am an absolute champion for. It's fantastic.
So they'll volunteer to be the buddy, have that little bit of training, just to understand. Again, it's how much to do, when to step back. They can be a buddy and a learning partner, so every child will have a learning partner in different curriculum areas.
When I'm a buddy with Joe, the best part is when he shares his jokes with me, and now we're becoming really good friends, because I didn't know Joe very well, but now, because I'm his buddy, I get to know him a bit better, so I'm getting to know his personality and what he likes now a bit better.
The major feature is that children, they seek out the disabled children play with just as they'd play with any other child. And if you watch during school times or play times and watch the playground, you can see them just playing perfectly naturally. There's no one's forced to play with anybody. They choose to.
It's a massive benefit to Matthew. Matthew was barely speaking before he came into this school. He would say a few words. He now holds conversations with me. So socially, Matthew needed to be in a school like this.
So we'll only do A because I think we're running short of time. How could the good inclusive practice seen at Emerson's Green be introduced into a school in a low or middle income country? What will we need to do? So if you can put some ideas down, we've just got enough for a short round on that in about a minute, with Gemma reading some of those ideas out, and then we need to wind up.
Could you just read the question again, please, and then have a minute?
How could the good inclusive practice seen at Emerson's Green, what you've just seen in the last 6 minutes, be introduced into a school in a low or middle income country, in your country, let's say, where you live? If you're not in, even if you're in New Zealand or Canada or UK, you could still think about it. Okay, we've got any ideas coming through yet?
They're just starting to come in. Can you just give us about another 20 seconds?
Sure. I'm just conscious of the clock, which is always against us on these things.
Okay.
Okay, I think we do need to take them now.
Okay, no problem. So more than one person said the buddy system is a very good practice and doesn't cost anything.
Exactly, and we saw an example. If you go back to the film we did, presentation, Mapika, child to child, that is a buddy system. So it was used in Zambia very effectively. It can be used anywhere. So yes, child.
So
study.
yeah, a few people said that.
Yeah.
With modern technology, I think the apps would be useful. Special ed's inclusive training is necessary. Sorry, can't shut my dog up from here.
Right. I think one of the things we may see in the wake of the COVID is to get all children online, because that's one of the demands that's being made internationally now by IDA and IDVC and so on. So I think there's a possibility. We might have to get electricity into a lot of our schools first, but it will come. Okay, so using modern technology.
So here we go. Somebody from South Africa. I think the first place to start is that when new schools are being built, they should be built with inclusion in mind from the get-go. Secondly, I believe the buddy system is a good way.
Yeah.
Awareness and including training such as teacher training colleges and low-cost strategies like the buddy system again.
Yeah.
For our countries to adopt the inclusive education system, we training of teachers on mainstreaming disability. This goes to tell us that there are cooperative measures among DPOs, concerned stakeholders, enabling law and government backing. The framework is good, so that could be applied. Awareness creation through engagement meetings with stakeholders, sensitizing them about disability. Let me double check. Yeah, again, training of teachers to understand the importance of inclusion in education.
Okay. All the films that we have seen in this session, both in the presentation and here, we will put up separately on the website. The captioned and signed ones will be within the films, but for people to want to use them to show elsewhere in their community and then start discussions, that might be a useful thing as well for people to have.
So Richard, just while we're on that subject, that's obviously after the course is finished and we've got clearance to use things outside of this training.
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
Okay, now I'm not going to go through this. There's things we need to do there, but I'm going to ask Sarah to say this last word on this, and then I will come in with the last point. Sarah, can I bring you in again? If you're still with us?
Yes, I am.
Yeah. So we have a choice, and it's encapsulated in this slide, really.
Okay. Which way for the world? People or profits? And we are asking if is it competition or collaboration? And I know we want more of collaboration than competition.
Yeah.
And also the world needs to move in developing disability equality and inclusion to make a lasting shift to people. Will the world economic recession be resolved in favor of the finance capitalists or the poor and the marginalized? So which way for the world?
And I think inclusion, perhaps more than any other of the topics that we're looking at, goes to the heart of this issue, because it's not just about squeezing the most able children out of the population. Education is for life and education is for everyone. And it's about feeling okay about yourself, about communicating with your peers and being aware of the world, the history of the world, your place in the world. And that is something that everyone is entitled to. So really we have to put our foot down on the accelerator of history here to make sure that much more resource and much more government plans are aimed at inclusive education and much more involvement of the local community, because when the local community is involved, we get really good examples of practice and teachers coming on board, seeing the need to do this shift. So I'll just come out of this PowerPoint and say, you can all put on your cameras now and so on, we can say goodbye, but I wanted to make a point, as there are many more of you, please fill in the evaluation that was sent to you last week. We need that in order to get more funding to carry on with this work. So we need to show that it's being gratefully received by you. So please fill in the evaluation. We will see you all again next week. It's girls and women and disability. And we've got a strong team of women from our executive who are leading on that. So we welcome you to come to that. And the work for that is going up tonight, as well as the presentation. So we're keeping you busy, but I hope you're finding it interesting anyway. So thank you all for being on the call tonight. Thank you very much.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Goodbye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye. Thank
Bye.
you. Bye.